Martin North, John Adams, and Robbie Barwick in the interests of the people. Hi, guys.
Hi, Martin. How you going?
Pretty good. And welcome to Robbie from the CEC, because you guys have been over in the West and you found some rather interesting things.
Indeed. So the CEC about a week and a half ago invited me to go to Perth and to present about my economic Armageddon thesis to their members and some of the people watching the show. So I did that, but while we had the opportunity to look around Perth, given that the Perth market has almost fallen by 20%, I said, well, let's go a few days early and let's try to make a sort of show of it. And one of the places I was told consistently that I needed to go from a whole series of supporters over in the West was Mandurah, which is about an hour's south of Perth. So basically, I got told it was a city that had a huge boom, particularly coinciding with the mining boom, and now that the mining boom has sort of faded and property prices in Perth have fallen away, this particular city has really hit it hard. So I think it's fair to say that property prices from the peak in Mandurah has fallen about 30%. Rents have fallen 30%. A lot of Perth residents bought holiday homes down in Mandurah, which is on the water, and so it's really gone through a lot of turmoil. And so we went down, Robbie and I and someone else from the CEC went down one morning for a few hours, and one of the things that shocked us, and it didn't take us long, was once we got into the first set of streets in Mandurah, there is just enormous amounts of for sale signs, for rent signs, for lease signs, I think this show is quite important because it will give people, not just in Western Australia, but people here on the East Coast, a sign of when the housing market fully blows out, you're going to see what is in Mandurah today right across the country, and it is not a pretty sight at all.
Well, why don't we play the video of your first impressions, right? Because essentially you can quite quickly see the high number of for sale and for lease signs, remarkable number in a very short period. Let's watch that.
Yep.
So, John, Robbie, surprised by what you saw?
I was definitely surprised. Unlike, this was John's first ever trip to Western Australia, and I promised him the weather would be great, and it wasn't. It was lousy. It was raining the whole time virtually. But I go there quite often because that's where my wife's family's from, and they're down south of Perth. But they've built this new freeway in recent years, and so now you get onto that freeway and you go all the way down to Bunbury, and you don't have to go through Mandurah anymore. And so I haven't been paying attention. And when we turned off the old highway into the entrance to Mandurah there, I was very, very surprised. I know I haven't seen anywhere in Australia like it. And with all those signs, house prices ain't going up in Mandurah anytime soon.
Well, it's interesting because I've been watching the West for about 6 or 7 years, right? Because the peak in the market over in the West was quite a few years ago. And we've been watching the decline in the West ever since. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I was talking to Four Corners, and I suggested they go and look in this precise postcode, right? Because my measures of mortgage stress and difficulty was very high then, right? But the point I want to make is this sort of stuff plays out not over a few months. This plays out over 4, 5, 6 years, right? So essentially the seeds to the current disadvantage and difficulty they've got over there were laid some years ago. It's a long, slow traffic accident.
Yes. Now, a couple of other points to make is, so on the day we were there, we had you on the phone, and you actually put out a tweet and said that according to your data set, Mandurah has the highest level of mortgage stress in Western Australia. So that was one. The day before we went down there, I actually had some meetings in the Western Australian State Parliament, and one of the local state members called Mandurah the ground zero for negative equity in the whole state. Yep. And so when you start to see all of these for sale signs and for rent signs. So there's two aspects of Mandurah. There is the suburban streets, and then once you get down to the marina, where there's a commercial precinct. So we got out of the car, we walked down, we spoke to some of the locals, we looked at how busy the shops were. Now, this was about 8:30, 8:45 in the morning, but it was basically dead. And we had been told throughout the morning that commercial activity in the whole region has basically collapsed, and there's a high level of unemployment, high level of youth unemployment, and there is a whole host of social problems now manifesting itself in that part of Western Australia. And obviously we can point to a lot of this originating from a very poor economy.
Sure. Well, let me just go through a few of the stats that I've got in my model, right? So the average price, house price, peaked there in 2014 at $340,000. The average is now $240,000, right? The average unit price peaked in 2011 at $450,000 and is now $230,000. And around 21% of properties are unoccupied. And wait for this, 41% of households are either underemployed or unemployed.
Yes, well, and on that particular statistic, so we actually had a coffee with a former federal member of parliament who lives in that area, and one of the things he told us about a recent observation was in the local cinema complex there were 2 part-time jobs going in the cinema in Mandurah, and basically the line of applicants for just 2 part-time jobs was 250 metres. So, look, it is extremely difficult given economic policy settings to get work and for business to be able to be able to make a profit. When you see massive amounts of mortgage stress, massive amounts of negative equity, high levels of unemployment, you can understand why there are a festering of social problems happening in that part of the country.
Well, there are social consequences, right? And that's the point. And sometimes I think that we get over-rationalistic about house prices and negative equity and things, right? But there are real, true consequences. I mean, Eddie Hobbs made this point, right, from talking from Ireland. This is a big deal because it has social consequences, and it really does have, a spillover effect into almost every corner of society when these sorts of things start going wrong.
WA has a terrible drug problem in general, so it's quite shocking to be told that that Mandurah is the meth capital of WA when it itself is probably the ice capital of the world. And those stats are driven by the economic problems that are just compounding there.
And it's
I remember my brother-in-law. Sorry, my brother-in-law. I spoke to him. I got a lot of family live over there. He was describing to me how a decade ago Mandurah was the place to be. Right, everyone wanted to get in. It was it was the happening place in Western Australia. So you got to to me, what's disturbing is this is a microcosm of the country here, right? Both from this incredible boom where there's all this hype, and then when the wheels come off. Now it's been a slow motion train wreck by the looks of it. One of the people we met described it to me as, oh well, this has been going on since 2014. It's become normal, right? And that's where John and I, coming from the East Coast, very aware of the state of the Melbourne, much bigger Melbourne and Sydney markets, right? And where they're at the moment, and wondering and sort of applying. Okay, if Mandurah, that kind of malaise spread across Australia to places like Melbourne and Sydney, what sort of condition we would be in. Therefore, that helped drive our shock. When we saw Mandurah, it can get this bad, and that fresh perspective was something she was even surprised to have expressed to her, because she's started to regard it as normal. But as you say, there's a delay, there's a lag time. And just because it might go slowly, it definitely goes in the one direction. It's not going up, it's going down. And when, like I said before, when you see all these houses for sale, it's not going to turn around anytime soon.
You're right. And the interesting thing about the Four Corners discussion that I had was we separated out the market into the investment sector and the owner-occupied sector, right? And a couple of years ago, it was the investment sector who was definitely leading the way down, because effectively rentals had dropped by a third. Many people with investment properties couldn't actually get any tenants at all, and basically it was an economically blown proposition. But what's happened since then is that the amount of stress in the system and the broader pressure on households, particularly those from a cost of living perspective, the fact that incomes have not risen at all, it's now spilling over to the owner-occupied sector as well. So effectively double whammy, right? But to emphasise the point again, this takes years to work out. And it's not surprising that Moody's and Standard & Poor's are now saying that defaults are up at 3%, which is double what it is in the rest of the country. But the point that you made, Robbie, and the point I want to make again is we should regard this example here as a leading indicator of what could happen more broadly down the East Coast. Because the same conditions, particularly now, are very much in play, with very high home prices, with extended valuations, high mortgages, unemployment beginning to rise, cost of living rising, incomes not rising. And we are at a very critical tipping point. And frankly, the decisions that have been taken in the last couple of weeks to try and resurrect the housing market once again is just going to force this further into the future. But it's still set for, I think, quite a similar path to what we've seen in the West.
Yes, and so I'll make a couple of points. The first one was when Robbie and the CC asked me whether I'd be willing to whether I'd be willing to go west. One of the reasons why I wanted to go west was because I know that because it does take years for these things to play out. One of the important reasons for doing this show is to give people on the East Coast a sense as to what's happening on the West, and to say that. Like you said, it's a leading indicator. What's happening in the West is going to play out here on the East Coast, and Mandurah is ground zero for how. Well, here's the thing: people in the West, it was expressed to me that Armageddon has occurred because of how bad it is, and it's very, very bad compared to the East Coast. But even with as bad as Mandurah is, the debt bubble hasn't blown up. The domestic bubble, the global bubble hasn't blown up. So I was telling people over there, if you think this is Armageddon, even though it is horrific compared to the rest of the country, you have, you still don't understand what I'm personally talking about when I talk about Armageddon. I mean, we haven't even started that, and yet, so we have a bad economy, we have some social problems. I mean, I'll just go through a couple of things that I noted. So, the local paper out there was a massive brawl with 20 youths. I think it was reported in WA Today. In the local nightclub, there's been some stabbings there. There is some massive amounts of drug use in that part of the country. It was interesting, 2 years ago, the federal government looked at doing some test sites around doing drug tests for welfare recipients, and Mandurah was the third site selected. So Christian Porter, who was, I think, the Social Services Minister at the time, now is the Attorney General. He's obviously from Western Australia. I mean, he had actually a very interesting quote to say at the time 2 years ago, so I just want to read that quote. So this is from 27th August 2017. Christian Porter: in a place like Mandurah, we've seen internal data to the government show a 300% increase in the number of people excusing themselves out of things like job interviews because of drug use. So once you start to see a bad economy and people getting into all sorts of social problems like violence, like alcohol, like drugs, it actually inhibits their ability to participate in the economy, and that obviously leads to greater complexity of how do you actually resolve a poor economy and a whole host of festering social problems. So obviously, we went there. We were extremely shocked, and obviously, like Robbie said, Robbie's been there many times. This was my first time out west, and I think more people, more researchers, more people in the press, and I've actually encouraged some journalists from the ABC who I speak to go, now that Four Corners went 2 years ago, I've said to some of these people, go back again, have a look, get some footage, talk to the locals, and hopefully with some of the footage we've played in this show, maybe some mainstream journalists and mainstream media companies will go back down to Mandurah and actually document what's going on there, so that the nation can actually come to grips with how bad this is going to get.
And John, before you continue, the what you just described with this social problem and drug problem, it's completely out of kilter with how the place looks. Right, this is a very nice area of Western Australia, especially on the waterfront there. This is quite seemingly upmarket. You're describing something that, in my mind, it more fits with a place like Footscray in Melbourne, right? That kind of terrible drug problem. It just doesn't fit with Mandurah, and you really see, therefore, that there's an economic driver here because of it became the centre of the bubble because of the excesses to do with the mining boom. But the banks trying to we had people telling us how the banks, in a sense, preyed on these cashed up miners here. Buy, invest. Remember, it was Western Australia where there was that nurse who had $3 million in debt or something, or $4 million in debt from investment properties. They really encourage them, get in there and do this. And now it's price that they're trapped in the combination of negative equity and mortgage stress. And so with mortgage stress, they want to bail out. With negative equity, they can't bail out because they're not going to be free of their debt. And it's all come to a perfect storm in Mandurah.
What's interesting, Robbie, is that my analysis suggests that it isn't just this one postcode, right? You can go up the coastal strip south and north of Perth, and you can see the same sorts of things again and again. And you can see the modern estates that have been built very close together with very large properties quite often, right? People massively mortgaged up, many of them now in negative equity, many of them in mortgage stress, and many of them with no way out. And that is why the level of defaults are so high. And that is why, unless we see some fundamental different thinking about how to deal with the property bubble and people who have been made bad loans and those sorts of things, this is going to play out extremely badly over quite a long period of time. The other point to make is that a lot of the reporting of the defaults and the bad news over in the West is always downplayed. particularly down the east coast, right? You know, they always say, oh well, it's only the west, it's only that, and up in Queensland, right? As though somehow it's another country.
Well, yeah, but one of the reasons why they do say that is that they say it's specifically because of the mining cycle. It was the mining boom, and so obviously that doesn't we didn't have a mining boom in, say, Victoria, New South Wales, to the extent that Western Australia and Queensland. Therefore, the parallels or the comparisons or what we can deduce from Western Australia is limited. I mean that's the justification.
Yeah, it is, but.
This is not a mining town. All the mining towns have sunk. We've seen that. This is one step removed from that. That's supposed to have a more varied economy, and it is in real trouble. It's starting to get into mining town territory.
Yeah, well, that's right. And I was going to say that you can actually look at some of the mining towns, and the mortgage stress is even worse. But it's a small number of people. Right?
Yes. The
thing about this strip down the coast is there are many thousands of households in this situation. Right, so this is a big enough problem to actually register on the Richter scale. Right?
Yes. Although the thing is, look, so just to be fair, so other than just the specific city of Mandurah, we did drive to some of the neighbouring cities in the region, and to be honest, I personally didn't see the volume of for sale signs like in Mandurah. So for whatever reason, this particular town in that broader region is really hitting it hard.
Yeah, I agree. And I still think they are one of the leading indicators. But my point is, don't think of this one postcode as being the only problem area. Right?
Oh, of course, yes.
This is an indicator of something much broader.
Yeah, and I think that's important because given that we do know, and I asked you this in the car, remember, there is this competing pressure between negative equity and mortgage stress, right? So it's obviously when most of people in Western Australia are in some kind of negative equity, probably, or very close to it, if prices are 20% down across the board, Mandurah is 30% down, so their negative equity is the most. But they've obviously reached a point where the people that are trying to sell those homes that we saw, and lots of them, they've given up trying to hang on, whereas most other people in the suburbs that we saw including just around Mandurah and in other parts of Perth, they're not at that point yet, but they're still in negative equity, and they're just hoping that something will come. And people express that to us. They're hoping, there's higher iron ore prices at the moment, right? Which is a bit of a fluke, frankly, but there is. That's benefiting Western Australia. And they're hoping that filters through into a change in the property market. But yeah, I think that's going to be wishful thinking.
Hope isn't a plan, I'm afraid, and that's really the problem, right? So there's a message, I think, to those in power and to the politicians that they should wake up and smell the roses here, because this is a really important leading indicator of an issue that is going to become ever more difficult to wrangle ahead, because there's no prospect, I think, of the economy turning around anytime soon. And as John said a little while ago, this is isolated from any global thing that may come over the top, right?
Yep.
Be it the US recession that people say may happen, or something in China, or something in Brexit, or wherever, right? There are lots of potential hotspots around the place. And so without those external factors, we've got issues. And of course, they could become a lot worse if, in fact, the global thing started to go wrong too.
Absolutely.
So,
and what struck me, just quickly, what struck me was when I saw it, I'm thinking, my goodness, what does this mean for the banks if this becomes more widespread, given their level of risk? And I think, John, you tweeted that inside tip that there are banks in Western Australia that are already, calling in loans in some form from this area because they want to exit out of this area. And again, so if that's spread around Australia, we're not just talking about a general problem, we're talking about a specific problem in the banks, which is one of our
Robbie,
concerns.
just on that, because I was going to mention it, a lot of those postcodes, the difficult postcodes, they won't lend more than 70% loan-to-value ratio at the moment, right? So they've got new, tighter lending standards in a lot of these areas. And a lot of people who've tried to get mortgages, and particularly to refinance onto these new, cheap, lower mortgages, can't. So they're actually mortgage prisoners on rates of interest that are much higher than the best available because of the higher risk profile. So effectively, even if you do try to manage your way through this, economically speaking, it's a tough ask. So I think just to summarise, the reports that you guys have played tonight are really, really important. And it does give us some very important food for thought in terms of what may happen ahead. And that this is not just a financial issue, but it's actually a social issue too.
Absolutely.
Robbie, John, thank you very much.
For sure.
Thank you very much.
Martin North, John Adams, Robbie Barwick, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.